Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes, inshallah, as we let people funnel into the room, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our community learning circle. We're going to go ahead and get started. Inshallah, today we'll be talking about navigating depression and its manifestations, and we're so honored and humbled to be joined by Dr. Sadia Dinani. Alhamdulillah. So to start us off, just a little bit about Meristan for those of you who are just joining us for the first time or haven't attended a learning circle before. The literal meaning of Meristan is actually an institution of healing, and these institutions were the first treatment centers for treating psychological illnesses in our Islamic history. And so our organization, Meristan, is a clinical, educational, and research-based initiative, which is inspired by the historical function of these traditional Meristans. And so these traditional Meristans actually provided holistic treatment based on environmental and personal factors for the well-being of the body, the mind, and the soul. And so Meristan's goal is to revive the Islamic tradition and functions of Meristans by leading professional clinical care, education, and research in advancing holistic mental and spiritual wellness. And so part of this initiative is our learning circles like the one that we are having today, alhamdulillah, which is an opportunity for the provision of psychoeducational information and care to our community through the means of a webinar, which is accessible to many. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Before we get into our webinar, just a couple of learning circle agreements that we'd like to share with everybody. Starting off with understanding that this is a safe space. The shared microphone segment of this session will not be recorded during our Q&A. However, we will record the actual information portion so that we can share it for others to access who are not able to join us today. We ask that everyone be mindful of what you say, thinking about potential things that may be triggering or different scenarios while you're speaking if you do have the microphone at this time. Sharing your name if you choose and are comfortable. Sharing the mic allows us to feel honored, heard, and safe. So please share your name if you're comfortable. Keeping comments relevant to the topic of our discussion today. Keeping your comments short and brief to allow everybody to have an opportunity to share. And of course, we ask that there is no disrespect or derogatory commentary. And if this does take place, we will remove you from the Zoom, inshallah. Okay. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sadia Dinani, who is a fellow physician in Stanford's Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship Program. She completed her adult psychiatry residency training at Stanford in June of 2023. She has a particular interest in Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology, the intersection of medicine and technology, the parent-child relationship, anxiety disorders, and identity-based trauma in the Muslim community and first and second generation immigrants. She serves as a psychiatric consultant for Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab. Along with Dr. Rania Awad, she is a co-trainer for Maristan Suicide Response Training, which is a training they deliver to religious and community leaders in cities across the country. She's been a guest lecturer at Harvard's Divinity School, has worked on a number of publications, and has engaged in community work to educate on mental health, dispel the stigma of psychiatric conditions and treatments, and provide a framework to understand the Islamic perspective on mental health. Dr. Dhanani has also completed a one-year intensive Quranic Arabic program and has spent time studying the Islamic sciences. She's a Quran teacher and has continued her Quranic and Islamic studies education alongside her medical career, mashallah. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Dhanani. We're very excited to have you, alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah khairan.
Okay, just a quick roadmap agenda before I hand it over to Dr. Dhanani. Today we'll be talking about navigating depression and its manifestations. So we'll be going through education on depression and learning about the signs and symptoms of depression with a focus on how cultural beliefs and context can influence our understanding and experiences. We'll hear the Islamic perspective and discover how Islamic teachings and principles can guide us in navigating mental health challenges, fostering resilience, and seeking help. We'll also hear resources and coping strategies to equip ourselves with valuable knowledge about mental health resources, effective coping strategies, and the importance of reaching out for support when it's needed, as well as access to help, providing information on local and online mental health resources to ensure participants know where to turn for assistance if it is needed. And then last but not least, our broader objectives for today are to provide information on local and online mental health resources, educate about the signs and symptoms of depression, including cultural and contextual factors that may affect this understanding, provide an Islamic understanding of navigating depression, and equip ourselves with knowledge about mental health resources, coping strategies, and the importance of seeking help, inshallah. And so with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Dhanani to lead us the rest of the way, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. I know I cannot see you guys, but I think you can see me. So bismillah, let's go ahead and get started. I will share my slides. All right, Janan, can you confirm that we can all see this? Okay, we're good. All right. Thank you all so much for being here today. This is a really, really important topic, and I'm so glad that Maristan has chosen to do a learning circle on this. Rates of depression in the United States have been increasing over the last decade, particularly after or since the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. I'm sure we have some international folks here as well. I can't speak to statistics internationally, but certainly from a national perspective. And so as Janan had mentioned, I wanted to speak about depression from a clinical standpoint and from a psychiatric standpoint. And then in addition, we will also talk about the Islamic perspective on mental health and how we view mental health based on the prophetic tradition. So a quick disclaimer, the information provided in this learning circle is solely for educational purposes. It should not be used for diagnosis, assessment, or treatment decisions for yourself or for anyone else that you know without discussing further with your primary care doctor or a psychiatrist. And in addition, my views and opinions are my own and do not reflect the views of my employer. So when we think about from a psychological perspective, when we think about the care model, typically what we have understood historically is that we operate from a biopsychosocial model of care, meaning that we address treatment and we address management of mental health conditions through a biopsychosocial model. What that means is that we look at the biological component of one's mental health, and the biological component of treatment. So that might be things like medication, for example. We look at the psychological component of treatment and management of care, and we look at the social component of care as well. However, what more and more folks are looking into is the spiritual component as well. We know that that actually plays a really big part in how we interpret mental health, how we understand and conceptualize our own mental health, and it also really builds elements of resilience, builds coping strategies. Um, when we include spirituality within the conversation for how we manage and treat mental health conditions. And if you actually look into, there are several papers on this. When we think about coping strategies, there are 5 different aspects or elements of coping strategies, and all of this is actually addressed through religion. So things like community, which is really important. Things um, um, like a world perspective or a framework for how we see the world, among other things. So if we think about the biological perspective of, or the biological component of care, we think about biochemical systems, physiological systems, things that are happening internally, our brain chemistry, hormones, things like that, that impact our physical, mental, emotional health. When we think about the psychological dimension, we think about cognition, perception, our personality traits, our behaviors, our attitude, the way that we perceive other things and perceive ourselves, self-esteem, for example, how we cope, our resilience. And then when we think about the social component, we consider culture, circumstances. This can also include socioeconomic status, education level, where we live, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, even within the United States, are we living in a rural environment, an urban environment, and otherwise. And then when we think about the spiritual component, we think about what role faith can play in our lives. We think about spiritual experiences, higher levels of consciousness. This is where oftentimes we, as Muslims, might have the conversation about things like which is unseen. So whether it's jinn, we might have the conversation about ruqya, jinn possession, things like that. And that's often where I think most people tend to end up initially when we think about mental health. I think oftentimes there is this misconception that it must only be driven by the spiritual realm. However, that's neglecting all of these other parts that are a very real component as well. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about just Islamic psychology's view on mental health. This is a little different than what you typically see in the secular model, but Islamic psychology really provides a holistic view and a holistic perspective on mental health. So it encapsulates physical health or psychological health, emotional health, um, social and behavioral health, in addition to spiritual health. And so what we know is that our mental health is influenced by genetics, our environment, our life experiences, our brain function and chemistry, our hormones, and so many other things. All of how we operate from a mental health perspective is multifactorial. So getting a little bit into depression. So what is depression and how can we see the manifestations of depression within ourselves or in other people? And again, I highlight here that everything that we speak about today, these next few slides, when I kind of discuss what depression looks like and how it manifests, I really want to emphasize that this is not for self-diagnosis. This is not to diagnose other people. This is really just from an educational perspective. And my hope is that for anyone who may be suffering from symptoms of depression or this resonates, this might be an indication that you can reach out to your primary care doctor, a psychiatrist, and receive the help that you need. I think my sharing stopped. Just one moment. Janan, are you still able to see?
It's a bit cut off.
Okay.
There we go. Looks
Okay.
good.
Okay, so in speaking about depression, we can think about symptoms in a few different categories. We can think about the emotional symptoms, behavioral symptoms, and physical symptoms of depression. And so when we break that up, what are the emotional symptoms of depression? What does that look like? So that can include things like persistent, profound feelings of low mood or depression. And I'll talk about this in a little bit. Depression is different than sadness. It's this profound, deep, low mood, profound sadness that oftentimes does not alleviate. So it's past that normal spectrum of what you would consider as sadness. The emotional symptoms also include hopelessness, which tends to be one of the symptoms that we are most often concerned about, especially as it relates to suicide or concerns for self-harm, irritability. So actually, if there are concerns for depression in teenagers or children, oftentimes the first symptom that shows up is not actually low mood or depression or depressed mood for kids or teenagers. It's actually irritability. And so sometimes that can be missed because parents might think, why is my child acting out in this way? What's going on? Are they just a teenager? Is this hormones? It could be, and it very well could also be a symptom of depression. So that's something to keep in mind. Um, you also might experience increased feelings of worthlessness or increased feelings of guilt. So, from a behavioral perspective, you might see withdrawal or isolation. So, someone might be pulling away from engaging in social activities. Even within the home, you might find that they're spending more time in their room or in bed. You might find that they have disrupted sleep. And this can look like either less sleep, meaning that they're either having a really hard time falling asleep or they're waking up often during their sleep, or you might find that they're sleeping all the time, or there's this increased amount of sleep. Um, Someone can also experience difficulty with concentration or focus if they're experiencing bouts of depression. And then from the physical symptoms of depression, we think about fatigue or low energy. We think about appetite changes. So again, this can include a decreased appetite where maybe someone's not inclined to eat as much as they usually do, or they're overeating. And then you can also see somatic symptoms. What I mean by somatic symptoms are physical symptoms that are demonstrated through the body. So this can be things like headaches, stomach aches. Oftentimes in young kids, we might actually hear more somatic symptoms, especially in the 10 and under group. We'll hear more symptoms of like a belly ache or a headache or something like that that might be indicative of depression as opposed to just a physical ailment. Um, it's also very interesting. There's a lot of research to show that in Asian populations, and this is across the board, South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, et cetera, that physical symptoms of depression are often the first to manifest or are the first to be evaluated and examined by a doctor. Because oftentimes in these communities, mental health is very stigmatized. And so that's not something that's talked about. However, what we know is that our mind and body are connected. And so oftentimes the symptoms of our mental health will manifest in physical ways. So what we know is that depression affects the mind, the body, and our social connections. And so again, we want to focus on a holistic approach to healing. So looking at structural and social factors in depression, there are a few different things to consider. So when we think about discrimination, that certainly is a component of can be a component of a manifestation of depression. So folks who are experiencing discrimination on a daily, weekly, just a very often basis. So it can be things like anti-Muslim discrimination, it can be racism, sexism, other kind of isms according to your marginalized identity that can contribute to chronic stress. It can contribute to feelings of isolation. It can contribute to feelings of not feeling like you belong, feelings of low self-esteem and worthlessness. All of these things um, can contribute to depressive symptoms. And then economic inequality. So again, for folks who struggle with the socioeconomic status, you find that poverty and lack of access to resources can certainly impact one's vulnerability to depression and other mental health challenges. And then social isolation, we spoke about this just a little bit in terms of this can actually be a symptom of depression, right? Someone is withdrawing or spending more time by themselves. However, we also see that social isolation can increase the risk of depression. And we particularly see this in the elderly. Oftentimes, they don't have as many folks around them or don't have as many social circles as they once used to. And that can also contribute to depression. And lastly, we have intersectional impact. So we want to think about people with multiple marginalized identities. So that might be Muslim women, that can be refugees, immigrants, etc. And for them, their experience can they can experience compounding stress that is a result of overlapping structures of inequity and oppression. So if we think about an example, if you have a Muslim woman of color, she may experience anti-Muslim rhetoric for being a Muslim. She may experience sexism for being a woman, and she may experience racism for being a person of color. And all of these things combined can lead to worsening isolation, again, increase in emotional distress, decrease in self-esteem, and again, increasing the risk for depression. And then we can think about the colonial legacy and Eurocentric frameworks in mental health systems. And so historically, what we know is that psychology is looked at through a Western framework. And Western psychology often has labeled traditional practices, including spiritual practices, as irrational. And so that in and of itself will undermine non-Western approaches to mental health, leaving people feeling alienated. However, what we know, and I'll speak about this in a little bit more detail in just a little bit, is that we have a very, very rich tradition of mental health within our history. So Abu Zayd al-Bakhi, who several of y'all might have heard of, is one of the foremost people in our history who speaks about mental health. He's written several books on it, and his approach to mental health is exactly what we're seeing in contemporary times today. However, he was writing about this back in the 9th century. And he speaks about depression, he speaks about anxiety, he speaks about obsessions, and he speaks about treatment that again aligns with a lot of what we're seeing in Western treatment today. However, he also adds in the component of the spiritual framework. And the Eurocentric framework leaves people feeling, again, feeling alienated, oftentimes in these communities. And then you have a feeling of cultural dissonance where you're navigating multiple cultural identities. So for example, if someone is an immigrant to the United States, they are not only managing their or thinking about their ethnic identity, and maybe also figuring out how to adopt or what it looks like to adopt some version of an American identity, maybe also trying to reconcile their Muslim identity, among other things. And again, this can lead to feelings of alienation and depression. And it's also important to consider intergenerational trauma, which is something that we've learned more about in the last several decades. But unresolved feelings of grief and shame can manifest as or contribute to depressive symptoms. And oftentimes, this unresolved grief and shame can be a result of things like colonialism, forced migration, slavery, among other things. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the Islamic perspectives on the causes of illness. So this is a little different than we'll break things up into pieces, but first, just thinking about causes of illness in general, not only mental health illnesses, but illness in general. So the Prophet ﷺ has said, "There's no disease that Allah has sent down except that He has also sent down its treatment." And so the way that we think about illness through the Islamic lens is that, again, it's not only based on one particular thing, it's multifactorial. So we are including the biological, psychological, and environmental theories. For illness, we're thinking about spiritual diseases. So if you think about the spiritual diseases of the heart, and we'll speak a little bit about Imam al-Ghazali, who speaks a lot about the spiritual diseases of the heart. And then we also consider supernatural explanation. So we don't omit this from our conceptualization of illness, right? So things like jinn possession or black magic or ayn or hasad, jealousy, evil eye, all of these things very much exist within our tradition, and it's irresponsible not to consider it. However, at the same time, it's irresponsible to completely negate everything else only in favor of a supernatural explanation. And then we can think about the spiritual purposes of illness and disease within Islam. So, oftentimes, what we hear, or something that you may have heard, you might have experienced, is that folks will say things like, "Oh, I'm experiencing this because Allah is mad at me," or Allah hates me, and so I'm experiencing this. Oftentimes, that is the language and the stigma that we see surrounding mental health is that people believe that it's a symptom of their lack of faith or some sort of deficiency in their faith or their iman or in their worship that has led to or is a direct cause of some sort of illness or tribulation in their life. And so you often might hear folks talking about mental health and treatment of mental health as just increase in your prayer, make dua, increase in your recitation of the Quran, which yes, we'll talk about, and that certainly can play a role. However, again, we are completely neglecting the very real biological causes of disease, the psychological, the environmental, the social, and the spiritual elements for developing illness and disease. And so, some other explanations and purposes of illness and disease from a spiritual perspective are things like it could be a test or a trial from Allah. And we know that in this world, we will be tested. We are going to be tried, right? No one is saved from that. What our test or trial looks like will just might look different than the next person. It could be a mercy from Allah. We know that Allah can use illness or disease as a means of expiation for our sins or an increase in rewards. We also know that being in a time of illness or sickness, our du'as are accepted, which is a mercy from Allah as well. So again, opportunities to ask for forgiveness and turn to Allah. Oftentimes, in times of tribulation, in times of difficulty, in times of um, tests or trials, this is often when folks are really reaching inward and reflecting, which is the purpose of our life, right? Our purpose here is to reflect on ourselves, increase in our knowledge of ourselves, to increase in our knowledge of Allah. And so this is often a time that folks can turn towards Allah and seek forgiveness, seek closeness and nearness to Him. So it can serve as a reminder from Allah, and it can also serve as spiritual growth and purification as well. So when we think about mental health in Islam, I mentioned that our tradition is very, very rich in how we address and talk about mental health. This is not something new that we've just been talking about in the last 50 years. If you have heard any of Dr. Rania's lectures or several other psychiatrists or psychologists who also have been overlap with Islamic psychology and Islamic studies, you'll hear how often how much we have in our tradition that speaks about mental health and the importance of addressing our mental health. And so Islamic scholars have dedicated their lives to studying the spiritual and psychological components of the human condition. I already mentioned, but I want to highlight again, Abu Zayd al-Bakhi, who has written several books about mental health. And he has highlighted over and over again the importance of, so first and foremost, he acknowledged mental health conditions, which was really important, especially given that so many folks often neglect acknowledging it in and of itself. So he acknowledged mental health conditions and then underscored how important it is for us to pay attention to mental health conditions in the way that we think about our own health and the health of other people. One thing that al-Bakhi did is that he actually differentiated and distinguished between sadness and depression. What we know about all of these emotions is that there is a spectrum that exists, and we have the spectrum of normal emotion, and then that can shift to the other side of the spectrum, which is pathological, which is something like depression, for example. And he talks about the severity of depression and how it is so far beyond that normal level of sadness that people can experience, and the amount of suffering that is involved in depression. And he really, again, underscores how difficult of a disease and an illness it is. Um, Al-Bakhi also talks about the four types of mental distress. So the ones that he focuses on are depression, anxiety, obsessions, and anger. So sadness, anger, anxiety, and obsessions. And he actually says he differentiates between endogenous and reactive depression. And again, this was in the ninth century. This was a long time ago. And it's argued that he was one of the first to differentiate between the two. Endogenous depression is where there's no clear understanding of what the trigger might be. Right. So we think about, again, it might be there might be biological factors that are contributing to it. There might be environmental or psychological factors, spiritual factors. But again, there's no one pinpointed reason or one pinpointed trigger that has led to this bout of depression. And then we have reactive depression, which might be a reaction to something that has happened in our life. And it goes past the kind of normal feelings, normal emotions, normal range of sadness. And in thinking about reactive depression, he has mentioned that you treat this with supportive psychotherapy. So, talking to someone that you trust, um, who can help kind of guide you, who can provide insight and perspective. And then in thinking about endogenous depression, he again highlights that endogenous depression needs to be treated with medication in addition to therapy. And again, this very much aligns with evidence-based medicine these days. So, as a psychiatrist, we operate from evidence-based medicine. And what evidence has shown us is in our treatment of depression, it's you can use medication, you can use therapy like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's often the combination of medication and therapy together that leads to the best results for our patients. And when I speak to patients, I always highlight this for them is that we can talk about medications, we can talk about therapy. However, the best results are going to come from a combination of the two. So, and Buckley was talking about this in the ninth century so long ago. Again, this is not coming from Western psychology. This has been in our tradition for a very long time. And he says that everyone will experience some level of mental distress in their life. However, it's just going to be on a spectrum. And so when we think about that, he also talks about how important it is for us to um, prepare ourselves, almost this level of like preventative medicine, preparing ourselves to deal with this emotional distress in our life. So we are all going to experience some level of distress in our life within our lifetime here. It's just going to look different for each of us. And the way that we react to it is going to be different just based on our personalities, our temperaments, our life circumstances, etc. And so he has said that we should all do things to preserve our mental health, um, which includes engaging in positive cognitions during times of stability. So, what that means is that when we are feeling healthy from a mental health, from an emotional perspective, it's important for us to that's the time that we really build our toolbox of how we take care of ourselves when things start to get hard. And again, positive cognitions is completely aligned with what we think about in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy. Positive statements to ourselves, the way that we talk about ourselves, the way that we talk to ourselves is really, really important. Often what we are saying out loud or what we're saying to ourselves, whether it's internally or out loud, becomes internalized in our subconscious, and then that manifests into our conscious mind. So it's always really important to pay attention to the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we talk to ourselves. Things like gratitude play a role here, right? And Allah has told us in the Quran that when we are grateful, He will increase us. And then he also highlights the importance of having people in our lives. And again, highlighting having people who are professionals regarding mental health in our lives who can provide perspective and insight when we're struggling. Because it's often when we are struggling with our mental health that that level of insight, that level of perspective goes out the window. And we tend to really struggle with that. It can be extremely hard for someone who is experiencing depression to recognize that they are experiencing symptoms of depression. It's excuse me, it's usually people around them who are noticing it first and who might point it out to them. But again, if someone doesn't have that level of insight, it can be really, really hard for them to accept that they are struggling with depression. And this might be something that you've experienced with either yourself or your family members or your friends, where you might want someone to reach out to seek help, to get treated for anxiety or depression, but they're really struggling with even accepting it. Um, and then I wanted to mention a couple other names from our history that again highlight mental health and the importance of treating mental health. So Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who has written many books about this, but he says in one of his books, the second category of diseases of the heart are based on emotional states such as anxiety, sadness, depression, and anger. These types of ailments can be treated naturally by treating the cause or with medicine that goes against the cause. And this is because the heart is harmed by what harms the body and vice versa. So two really, really important points here. One is that Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah is recognizing, again, acknowledging that all of these emotional illnesses exist, right? Sadness, depression, anger, anxiety, all of this exists within our tradition, within each human being. And the treatment of this is not only limited to spiritual treatment. The treatment of this is with medication. And he also highlights and underscores that what harms the body harms the heart and vice versa. Again, highlighting the mind-body connection of what's happening. So when our mental health, our emotional health is struggling, it can impact our physical health and vice versa. When our physical health is struggling, so if you think about people with chronic illnesses or new diagnoses, you often find that they can also start struggling with their mental health. And it's important to treat both. And this last piece I wanted to bring up, because again, I want to highlight that Islam is not a religion that excludes our mental health or treatment of our mental health. I think people often get confused, or there's a lot of stigma or misunderstanding that we should not be treating our mental health as any other condition like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, etc. All of this, we would go to a doctor, we would receive treatment, and we would theoretically stay on the treatment and use the medication, use whatever lifestyle changes, etc., that would lead to improved health. Why is that not the same for our mental health? And so there was a companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam who asked him, should we seek cures or should we just depend on Allah? Should we seek a cure for ailments or should we place our trust in Allah? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do both. So again, we want to think about treatment for our mental health, for our physical health, for our health all around, from the biopsychosocial spiritual model of care, right? So we think about the biological model of care, which could include things like medication, and psychological, things like therapy, coping skills, etc. And then the spiritual model of care. I want to again highlight this as well because I'm not saying that it's mutually exclusive. I think it's really important to recognize that when we are going through treatment or seeking treatment for our mental health, we don't have to neglect the spiritual element at the same time. No one's saying that you can only do Western medicine and neglect the spiritual element, or only do the spiritual treatment and neglect, biological treatment. What we advocate for is utilizing both because Allah has granted us both for a reason. And Allah tells us in the Quran, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So this is in Surah Al-Isra, ayah 82. And we send down the Quran that which is a healing and a mercy for the believers. So Allah tells us that in the Quran, there is healing, there is shifa for us. And so I will always advocate for folks for those who want to increase in your recitation of the Quran, absolutely. But again, that does not mean that you completely neglect the biological, the psychological treatment of your mental health condition as well. And we know, this is a very, very popular dua that I'm about to recite that a lot of folks know. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazn wal-'ajzi wal-kasl wal-jubni wal-bukhli wad-dala'i ad-dayn wa ghalabat ar-rijal. So this was a dua that was narrated by Anas bin Malik that the Prophet ﷺ used to say, "O Allah, I seek refuge with you from worry and grief, from incapacity and laziness, from cowardice and miserliness, and from being heavily in debt, and from being overpowered by men." And this is from Sahih Bukhari. again, the reason I bring this up is because this is showing us that the Prophet ﷺ did not neglect our mental health, our emotional health. He is asking for protection, for refuge from worry and grief. Um, if the Prophet ﷺ is asking for protection from this, what does that mean for us? Right? That means that we are also very much um, it's possible for us to struggle with worry and grief as well. So I wanted to bring up a few different examples from the prophetic tradition of how we can conceptualize and think about mental health. So we know from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ that he experienced the year of sadness. So this was after the time that his wife Khadija radiallahu anha passed away and his uncle had passed away. So he had lost two very, very important people in his life. He was he was basically being treated like an outcast in the society. Um, and it was a very, very difficult year. He was feeling it, it was a tremendous loss that he experienced, tremendous losses that he experienced. Um, but we see through the life of the Prophet ﷺ that he experienced all of these emotions, and he experienced grief. And then we know from the story of the Prophet, when the Prophet ﷺ lost his son, Ibrahim alayhi salam, or sorry, excuse me, the Prophet ﷺ lost his son, Ibrahim, he had said, when he lost his son, he was crying, right? So you have this physical manifestation of grief. And he had said, the eyes shed tears and the heart grieves, and we are saddened over your departure, O Ibrahim, but we will not say except that which is pleasing to our Lord. This is important because, again, the Prophet ﷺ is highlighting the grief that he is experiencing, the difficulty of losing his son, and again, acknowledging these emotions as very real, as very valid emotions to be experiencing. And when we think about the first revelation, so after the Prophet ﷺ was, received the first revelation and he came back down and who did he run to? He ran to his wife, Khadija radiallahu anha, and he was terrified, right? It was a very scary experience for him. He was very worried about what was going on. He was very afraid. He was shaken. And he turned to his wife, Khadija radiallahu anha, who held him, who provided comfort to him. And I wanted to bring this up for two reasons. One is that we see how we can support people when they are going through times of distress. Um, Khadija radiallahu anha provided comfort to him both physically by holding him. She also gave him the space to say what was going on. She listened to him without judgment. In a time where he was feeling that he wasn't sure what was happening, what was real. Khadija radiallahu anha listened to him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and allowed him to share his experience. So we learn how to provide support and comfort to someone. And then also we learn what happened afterwards. After the Prophet ﷺ told his wife about what happened, she provided the comfort and support. And then also what happened next, they went to her cousin, Waraq bin Nawfal, and sought guidance as to what to do next. So highlighting here is that after going through an experience, you recognize the limitations of what you are able to provide in terms of treatment, comfort, security, what have you, and then you seek professional help, right? So this was through a spiritual guide, but when it comes to our mental health, we want to seek treatment, we want to seek professional help from a mental health professional. And then lastly, we know in Surah Yusuf, Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam again experiences tremendous sadness and grief and stress after losing Yusuf alayhi salam, and they were separated for many years, and that led to a weakening of his eyesight. And I've read two different interpretations of this. Some say that he had lost his eyesight. Some say it was just the weakening of his eyesight. But nonetheless, again, what this is highlighting is the somatic symptoms of depression. So the physical manifestations of depression, of sadness, of grief, of our mental health. And so again, when our emotional health is struggling, that can manifest in physical ways and vice versa. So the reason I wanted to bring all of this up is because, again, if we go back to this concept of people saying things like, I'm struggling with my mental health because Allah is mad at me, or I'm being punished, or, Allah hates me, and that's why I'm depressed, or that's why I'm anxious. It's this pathological spirituality that is problematic because this is telling us that when we experience difficult things, it's a direct relationship between us and our Lord. And again, this is assuming that we have a vengeful Lord, but we know Allah is Ar-Rahman, He is Ar-Rahim, right? He is the most merciful, the most compassionate. And so we need to also fix the way that or shift the way that we think about Allah. And also at the same time, when we think about the seerah, when we think about the prophets and their stories and their lives, we're learning that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went through such difficulty. He went through loss, he went through grief, he went through sadness, he went through a range of emotions, and he is the most perfect human being. He's the most beloved human being to Allah. And so who are we to say that we are not going to go through these things when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself went through these things, and we have the stories of what happened, and we also learn from his example of how he handled it and what happened next. And so we want to reframe the way that we think about mental health and mental health illnesses and difficulties in general, right? That these are tests, these are trials that we go through, and it gives us an opportunity to learn more about ourselves, and it allows us spiritual and psychological growth that may otherwise not happen. And if you think about, again, Imam al-Ghazali highlights this um, in several of his works, but um, in The Alchemy of Happiness, Imam al-Ghazali talks about the importance of the knowledge of the self. And it's so important to gain knowledge of ourselves. And that often happens through difficulty, through adversity, because that forces us to look inwards and forces us to reflect on what's actually happening in our lives, what our purpose is in this world. And our purpose is to understand ourselves and understand Allah and to get closer to Him. And so let's move forward here. So I wanted to shift just a little bit. We've been speaking quite a bit about depression, and it would be irresponsible of me as a psychiatrist not to think about, the very real ramifications of untreated depression. Oftentimes, when depression is untreated, it can reach to a point where folks experience increase in suicidal ideation, so suicidal thoughts. And this is a spectrum. It can start with kind of this passive death wish, where someone might say that I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling so sad, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I wish I could go to sleep and not wake up, for example, or I wish I could die. And then that ranges from this passive thought of wanting to die all the way to I want to end my life and this is how I'm going to do it. There again, the risk for suicide and the thoughts of suicide, the causes are multifactorial. And so we see here that the risk for suicide, both ideation and behavior, can be impacted by the biopsychosocial model again. So when we think about the biological components, we think about genetic vulnerabilities. One of the questions that we ask when we do a psychiatric history is we ask about family history of suicide, because that actually increases the risk of suicide in remaining family members. So genetic vulnerability, physical health, chronic conditions can increase people's risk of depression as well as suicidal risk. Immune and stress response, lifestyle, intergenerational trauma, substance use. When we think about the psychological components, we think of feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness, avoidance of difficult emotions, being upset with Allah. So not only the feeling of that Allah is upset with us, or Allah hates us, or Allah has abandoned us, but also we might experience negative emotions towards Allah or negative emotions in our relationship with Allah. And then the spiritual component, including things like believing one is beyond forgiveness, for example, or feeling a lack of purpose in life. And then from the social component, things like culture, stigma, which is something we've talked quite a bit about, and something that needs to be talked about more. Socioeconomic status, bullying, feeling rejected from communities, discrimination. So when we think about the theories behind suicide, there is something called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And this theory highlights two major factors that contribute to a person's desire to take their own life. And these two factors include a perceived sense of burdensomeness, meaning that someone feels like a burden to either their family, society, their friends, people in their life. This can also include feeling like a burden to the people that you work with, and having a low self-esteem and believing that things are hopeless, that they are hopeless. Their ability to improve, to get better is hopeless. Um, and then the other component is a thwarted sense of belonging. So feeling lonely, socially isolated, rejected by larger society and or culture, also feeling rejected by your family or your community. And so how does this relate to for Muslims? So for Muslims, in terms of a perceived sense of burdensomeness, we think about the academic pressures that people can experience, the professional pressures that people can experience, in addition to pressure to maintain religious or cultural values, especially for folks who might be children of immigrants to the United States, or any other country. It can be hard to reconcile the different elements of their identity. And so younger and younger folks are experiencing more and more suicidal ideation. So the highest rates of suicidal ideation at this point in time and the highest rates, increasing rates of suicide are in the age range of 10 to 24 years old. Um, and so people at this age, or across the age range, can feel like they've disappointed their family by feeling like they're a burden to them, that they're not living up to whatever expectations are in place for them. They're not living up to the pressures that they have on themselves. Um, and they can have thoughts like, it would be better if I wasn't here. And then how the sense of belonging relates to Muslims is, again, American Muslims, and I'm speaking from the American perspective, being in the United States and the research that we've looked at. American Muslims often face challenges with acculturation, meaning that they can face challenges with adopting the culture of the country that they're in. So for American Muslims, that would be the United States. And then managing the American culture with the culture of their ethnic background, their religious background, etc. And so this can often impact friend, coworker, just work relationships. So the one easy kind of example is happy hour, right? A lot of people who are Muslim choose not to engage or go to happy hour, and that can be a struggle because on one end, they are struggling with maintaining and holding true to their Islamic values and morals. And then at the same time, they're recognizing, maybe they feel like they're losing out on professional opportunities because they are not at happy hour, they're losing out on building these relationships. And at the same time, they might also feel like they're struggling with, they can feel the impact on their family relationships if they are acculturating and then their family is really pulling them back and saying that you are no longer, aligned with your cultural values or your religious values. And so oftentimes people can feel really split and they feel isolated and they feel out of place. And so for Muslims in particular, the interpersonal theory of suicide is quite relevant. And we're seeing increasing, again, like I said, increasing rates of suicide and suicidal ideation in that 10 to 24-year age range, as well as increasing suicide attempts in the Muslim community. So where do we go from here? So I wanted to go through just a few take-home actions for addressing depression, on an individual level and then a community level. So from an individual level, we want to think about developing a routine. So finding ways to give yourself structure in your day. And so that can look like creating a morning routine and a nighttime routine, doing things at the same time every day. Behavioral activation is a really important component of depression treatment, just to get people going. Reconnecting with tradition and spirituality. Um, Again, I highlighted at the beginning that religion in and of itself actually encapsulates all five of the components of coping strategies, from a psychological framework. And so being rooted in religion, being rooted in spirituality can be a means of resilience, building resilience, for things like depression, anxiety, mental health conditions. Practicing gratitude. I spoke about Imam al-Ghazali really highlights the importance of our thoughts. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah also talks about this. The things that we say will enter into our unconscious and move to our conscious mind and be reflected in the way that we carry ourselves, the things that we internalize about ourselves. So practicing gratitude, and I had referenced the ayah from the Quran that Allah tells us that if we are grateful, He will increase us. And I encourage practicing gratitude not only in times that you're struggling with depression or anxiety or with your mental health, but practicing this when we are at a place of stability, because that practice builds the muscle for us to be able to do it when we are um, feeling depressed or feeling like we're struggling. If we try to build these muscles when we are struggling, it becomes much, much harder versus like if we build similar to working out, right? Or exercising. If we are exercising every day or maybe 5 days a week, whatever your schedule might look like, it builds the muscles over time. So that way, maybe on the days that we're not feeling too great, we can still engage in exercise or working out because we have built that muscle, we built that habit or routine. And so practicing gratitude, practicing the ways that we talk to ourselves and about ourselves, and recognizing the blessings around us is something that we should be doing at times where we are feeling stable and healthy from a mental and emotional perspective, as well as the times that we are struggling. And then, most importantly, we also want to make sure that we reach out and seek help when we need it. Um, there is a limit to how much we as friends, family members, etc., can do for people who are struggling with mental health. And I think, unfortunately, what tends to be the case is that people think that, unlike physical illnesses, that people can take care of the mental health conditions or illnesses of their loved ones without the need for a mental health professional. And that is absolutely not the case. We know the role of medications, we know the role of therapy, and either not helping someone reach out and get that help, um, or not reaching out yourself is really doing a disservice to your own mental health or to the mental health of the people around you. And then some take-home actions for addressing depression on a community level. One really, really important thing is addressing the stigma. Part of the reason that I got into psychiatry is to address the stigma within our Muslim communities, within our immigrant communities, because unless we talk about mental health and we talk about the ramifications of poor mental health, and the ways that we can improve our mental health, the ways that mental health have existed within our traditions, that this is not a contemporary issue, but it's very much something that's been addressed in our Islamic tradition, in our prophetic traditions, and from our scholars. This all helps us in not only understanding depression and mental health, but also hopefully helps us in seeking help when we need it. We want to advocate for structural change, hosting group healing circles. So Madison actually has healing circles that they host in addition to things like these learning circles. And this learning circle is great for hopefully addressing stigma as well. And then volunteering in the community. Lastly, I just want to end with some resources. So these are some Muslim mental health resources. Again, I apologize if you're international. Some of these are national or locally based, but Medistan and their website is there. It focuses on mental health within the Muslim community by integrating clinical psychology with Islamic teachings and practices. There is Nasiha Mental Health, and that offers confidential faith-based support through a mental health helpline for Muslims. It also provides crisis support and access to mental health resources. The Khalil Center and their website is listed there. And then for folks who are in the Bay Area, there's also a Bay Area Muslim Therapist website, which is searchable for providers in the Bay Area who provide mental health treatment. And then some national and international mental health resources. So these are a couple helplines in the United States, calling 988. You can also actually text 988. And I always tell that to my child and adolescent patients because texting is the new calling for their age range. So you can call or text 988 and it's available 24/7. for confidential support during a crisis. And there's also the crisis text line, which is for the USA, the UK, and Canada. And you can text hello to 741-741. And again, this is 24/7. It is free, and it provides mental health support. That is the end of my presentation, inshallah. And I think, Janan, we will do some questions now.
Yes, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Sadia, for sharing your wisdom with us. Inshallah, that was beneficial to everyone as much as it was for me. Alhamdulillah. So with that, we'll move into the Q&A portion. Before we do, I'm going to send a feedback form in the chat for you to just fill out after this program, inshallah, so that we can continue to provide informed care and meet the needs of our community, inshallah. Okay. And with that, I'll also pause the recording for this portion so everybody feels comfortable in asking the questions that they have and secure everyone's privacy, inshallah.